Hello out there, and welcome to our Express webinar series on achieving organizational agility with Scrum at scale. It's a bi-weekly series of short webinars, 30 minutes or less, in which experienced Scrum Scale experts share insights on how to apply Scrum at scale to implement organization-wide agility. I'm Jeff Sutherland, co-creator of Scrum and creator of Scrum at Scale, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Each webinar in the series will focus on a unique topic regarding Scrum Scale, today's being organizational descaling for faster teams. As a registrant of this web series, you'll be notified of future events and topics, and you may find a list of upcoming events on our website, scrumatscale.com/events. As you may be aware, Scrum at Scale is the natural extension of the core Scrum framework, within which networks of Scrum teams operating consistently with the Scrum Guide can readily adapt to changing business needs while delivering the level of performance of an individual. For an overview of Scrum at Scale, including many case studies, I suggest listening to my recorded webinar, Achieving Business Agility with Scrum at Scale, available on demand at our website, scrumatscale.com. And before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to just cover a couple of housekeeping items. First, to provide the best listening experience, all audio lines except the host and presenter will be muted during the webinar. If you'd like to ask the presenter a question, please use the Q&A panel on your console. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Use the chat feature to share comments with other webinar attendees, but be sure to direct all questions for presenters through the Q&A panel. Please note they will not be using the raise hand functionality. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to play on demand at the Scrum at Scale website and the Scrum at Scale YouTube channel. We're now ready to start the presentation, and I'd like to introduce our speakers, Carrie Driscoll and Steve Martin. I've worked with both of them a number of times. They've both been through the Certified Scrum training process where we spent a week together working on Scrum at Scale. Carrie's a VP of Agile Consulting and Delivery for Eliason Group and has over 25 years of experience working with organizations across multiple industries, including hardware, financial services, IT, big data, and many other types of organizations. She's taught and coached thousands of Agile teams. Steve is an enterprise Agile consultant, coach, and certified trainer who works with the management and executive teams as they adopt and expand Agile practices across their organization. He also has over 25 years of experience across Fortune 500 companies to startups in many different industries: finance, healthcare, medical devices, biotech, communications, publishing, and more. He's also working on his doctoral thesis about organizational change. So welcome, Carrie and Steve, and we thank you for sharing your insights today with us.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Carrie and I are very excited to be talking today about some organizational agility through the Scrum at Scale framework. Now, since some of you are new to Scrum at Scale, we wanted to provide some insights, some highlights about organizational agility. But before we begin that, we're going to talk a little bit about the Scrum at Scale framework, which is going to give you some ideas that when we talk about organizational descaling, it can give you a greater sense of reference. Now, as Jeff has already mentioned, he created this Scrum at Scale guide to help networks of Scrum teams across the organization become more effective in addressing complex adaptive problems. Now, through patterns and practices in the Scrum at Scale guide, organizations can set and execute an overall transformation strategy, which will help increase your organization's agility so that you can more successfully compete in today's uncertain and rapidly changing world. Now, from the diagram, we can see that there are two loops to the Scrum at Scale framework. The left-hand side is the Scrum Master cycle, which describes the how organizations can collaborate, coordinate, and work together. And on the right-hand side is the Product Owner cycle, which describes the what and the things that we should be working on. And this is basically how you generate value. Now, with so many components to choose from in this framework, and remember the Scrum at Scale's modular structure, you can start anywhere on this diagram. If you were to try and apply these scaling components on top of an unstable system, something that might be clogged up a little bit, then you might find yourself in a little bit of trouble. And this is what we mean by descaling. Going slow and taking a pause and making sure you're operating sufficiently well enough before you accelerate your scaling efforts and try to go even faster. So you can kind of think of descaling something like this. Think about how scale builds up inside a pipe over time. It's kind of like the white stuff you see in this photo. It's kind of nasty, right? Kind of restricts the flow. You need to remove this gunk out of the pipes before it can go full speed. And this is kind of like your organization. If you try to add scaling components onto a pipe that's full of gunk, it's not going to do anything. In fact, it might make things back up and make your situation even worse. So you need to descale your pipes, descale your organization, and make sure it's running clean before you can go fast. Now, with this definition, I'd like to introduce my partner in crime, Carrie Driscoll, who will introduce now 3 common areas in your organization you might want to descale as part of your transformation efforts. Hey, Carrie, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. When working with companies that have legacy systems in place, there are typically 3 areas in which we immediately see the need to descale. The first area is in how work is brought into teams, or the intake process, if you will. This is from the product owner side of the Scrum at Scale framework. If we try to implement Scrum at Scale and speed up the pace at which product decisions are made, but we don't have the supporting structures in place, this will quickly highlight where we have significant waste. For example, if you have a heavy process for vetting and approving product ideas or requirements, your system will clog up, become overwhelmed, and those key decisions, because of that heavy process, may become a large delay to getting product to the customer. We call this decision latency, and it is directly related to successfully implementing Scrum. The second area has to deal with executing Scrum well. One of the biggest enemies of Scrum is bad Scrum, or organizations that don't do Scrum well. If you have teams executing Scrum poorly, trying to expand on bad Scrum is not a good idea. I'll provide an example of this in a few minutes. And third, when you have multiple teams working on a product, they need to know immediately if the final integrated product is meeting their intended objectives. We need to know within each sprint. We don't want to have integration to take place down the road when it's often too late to solve for those problems, causing potential issues and delays down the road. Now that I've introduced the 3 areas, let me get into detail on the first one, how work is brought into the system. So it comes down to looking at work intake from 2 perspectives. First, from a top-down organizational perspective, and secondly, from a bottom-up team perspective. From a top-down perspective, one of the major issues we see are that some organizations at the highest level do not have a clear vision and strategy that then flows down via OKRs or goals to the folks that are actually doing the work, thus aligning the whole organization on the overall strategy or the true north, and then allowing them to tie that into the actual execution. From a bottom-up perspective, you may see issues if you have teams and programs trying to work off of a PMO-type governance model. Something like needing fully estimated PRDs or BRDs, product requirement documents or business requirement documents, approved before starting work on any aspect, or in some cases, once written, estimated, and approved by one layer, having them now have to get into a queue for the approval of a committee who only meets once monthly so that they can then discuss and approve if that item should move forward. Then, if that item doesn't get approval, it goes back into that long cycle again, pushing the actual start of work way off. This process is an example of a great place to start descaling. Steve, I understand that you might have a case study of how a company took in ideas for new work. Maybe you can lead us through that model.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Carrie. So let me present a model that we did at a financial services firm where it easily took between 3 and 4 weeks for an idea to even be considered to include in a release. Now, what happened in the past is that there was an idea that went to a BA who did some analysis, who wrote some specs with some others, got on a governance planning meeting if they had room. That was held once a month. And if actually everybody showed up, the idea might get approved for more requirements gathering and release planning. Now, this is despite all the requests that were coming in, typically flagged as mandatory or the hot item to work on. Now, in this new model, what we did is we descaled. We restructured the intake flow as well as some of the roles and responsibilities. So as ideas came in, a chief product owner looked at the request and compared it with the organization's vision, which really wasn't defined in the past. If it aligned with the vision, it went on a backlog as a pending status. If not, the requester was told, thank you very much for helping the product grow, and the idea was shelved. So what happened then was twice a week, the CPO got together with a set of product owners for that product to evaluate that idea. Now, this didn't take them long since there were only 2, 3, or maybe 4 ideas to look at, unlike the monthly governance meeting where they looked at a few dozen and it just took forever. If the idea in those twice weekly meetings had some merit, then the PO would take it and they would bring it into their team and do some further refinement. If not, thank you very much, and it was shelved and the requester was notified. So not only did requesters know if their idea was being worked on quickly, often within 24 to 48 hours, but they would also find out the priority it would be worked on and when it might be possibly pulled into a particular sprint in the future. Now, our next webinar in this series will cover a bit more about the product owner cycle. So if you want some more information, you can join us for next time. So a little plug for that. All right, so now that we've talked about some approaches for descaling on the product owner side, maybe we can talk about our next descaling component. So Carrie, take it from here.
Sure, Steve. What this next slide is showing is a bunch of leading indicators letting you know if you're doing Scrum well. For example, some of the things we have seen are companies that are trying to do Scrum, but instead of small teams, they have 15 plus people. Instead of product owners prioritizing the backlog based on daily information, there are proxy POs that need to get permission, thus delaying decision-making. Instead of retrospectives that provide team improvement of action items that go into your next sprint, there are unproductive meetings in which there are a lot of items identified to solve, but they never go into a sprint backlog or get executed against. Basically, if you are not following the Scrum DNA, if you don't have the 3 roles, are not doing the 5 events or utilizing the 3 artifacts, Scrum's 353, as well, if your teams are not delivering potentially shippable products at the end of every sprint, chances are that you are not executing Scrum well, and you would need to look into ways to descale prior to scaling. Remember, you only want to scale the good practices so that you can more successfully reach your business goals faster, whether they be speed to market, customer satisfaction, or all in, raising your overall company valuation.
Now, Carrie, this sounds great, but it's still sounding maybe a little bit high level to me. Maybe you can provide an example from one of your clients?
Sure. So I have a great example, and it's not that uncommon. So a 75-year-old manufacturing company decided to start an agile transformation and went with our suggestion of starting with a Scrum pilot. We worked together, set this team up with all the right roles, training, and Scrum DNA. They were a small, co-located, cross-functional, dedicated team focused on one prioritized backlog that was owned and reprioritized often by the product owner, who was from the business. This team did really, really well as they had the complete backing of the organization to do things outside the box in order to prove that Scrum works here and its benefits are indeed realized here at company XYZ. And it did. They delivered in half the time. There were very few quality issues, and most importantly for them, the customer was extremely satisfied. This team became the golden child. The company celebrated its success and quickly embarked on scaling out Scrum. Now, fast forward 3 years later, the company asked us to come in and do a health check as they knew that they have some scaling issues and some bad habits and wanted some support and getting them resolved. What we found is that the pre-existing waterfall structures and culture have taken their toll on this line of business. As they scaled, they had to compromise on certain aspects. Each compromise got them further and further away from the original Scrum DNA that made the pilot so very successful. So instead of small, stable teams, they now have 20 or more members. And some of them are only 25% dedicated to the actual work. Instead of experienced Scrum Masters, they have project managers / Scrum Masters required to play both roles. Instead of a customer advocating product owner, they have proxy product owners or BAs who may or may not want to be POs. Instead of quick daily Scrum meetings to replan, they have daily stand-ups now that last an hour and are run by the project manager. The goodness that they were trying to recreate did not scale out. Teams are not running at a sustainable pace, pushed to do more as they are now handed date and scope. This is all adding up to lower quality, people leaving as they are burning out, customers not getting product when they need, and then it's not always what they wanted.
Yeah, so it sounds like it was not a very good situation. Maybe you can quickly summarize what you did for your next step and how to get them moving forward again.
Absolutely. We worked with them to hit that reset button. Reset the good, remind them of why and how it worked so well the first time. Reset the behavior so as to change the culture and structure across the entire organization, including management and executives. There is only so much a team can do on their own. They need structures in place to allow for continued improvement to help them combat the legacy structures, which will push them back into that legacy world. Companies that have been purpose-built for product legacy systems now have to put intent and purpose behind building flexible, autonomous Scrum systems.
Yeah, so I think the key thing I'm taking away from this story and what I've seen with my other clients is that when you're scaling Scrum, it's not just adding more Scrum teams. You're going to have to take a look at the whole system, including the management, the executive team, and how these Scrum teams operate with the rest of the organization. So thank you for that. I see we're kind of a little pressed for time here. We want to keep the Express format going in the Express webinar. So I'm going to go over the third one kind of quickly. So when it comes to the third point and the third area that we want to descale, I want to kind of address how we can integrate products quickly. I mean, this point is a bit subtle because I was thinking the other day, it kind of goes back to the 12 Agile principles. Remember, like back in your CSM or your introductory Scrum training, that principle number 9 that says continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. By having that consistently integrated product, you're reducing risk from multiple perspectives, from a technical quality risk. By having something that works every single sprint, you know that it works and you've got a certain level of functional quality. From maintainability, from that risk perspective, you know that you can alter one part of the product without impacting another part of the product and move things faster. From a customer risk perspective, if you've got a product that's constantly integrated, they can look at the entire product and see how it's going to help solve their particular issues or solve their particular problems. Here's the net-net. The more time you spend integrating a product, the less time you spend adding value to your product. So this is why you want to invest a reasonable amount of infrastructure in how you pull products together. And this goes for technical products. It goes for non-technical products. It's basically for any type of product. I see we're kind of at the top of our time box here. So if you want some more examples of things from either like a DevOps book, or even Carrie had a great example from hardware, if you want to talk about some of those things in the future, please feel free to reach out to us. You'll see our contact information here shortly. But maybe Carrie, you can help us with some final thoughts that you might want to add for today.
Okay, thanks. So I think our final thoughts on organizational descaling around really it's something that the whole company needs to be on board with. Understanding why these challenges and blockers to flow, those items within the impediment heat map are causing such problems, and how the company can solve for them is something the senior leaders as well as the team members need to sign up for, weigh in on, And only this will allow for a full culture change. Getting enough folks to change their behavior is the only way to change the culture. Some solutions will be easier if the teams have Scrum DNA, if they have autonomy and the ability to solve their own challenges, they will flourish. They will scale well. The real test will be if they get challenged with something that is outside their realm of authority. How the organization responds will be key. If they are all in and there is engagement throughout the company, then most likely the impediment will get escalated to the right level, who will then support a quick solution so as to decrease waste and unclog that system. I feel like every leader needs to solve for clogs in the system and every employee needs to be a leader. So basically, everyone takes ownership of descaling. Do you have anything else you want to add, Steve?
Yeah, just kind of like I mentioned in my little introduction, when it comes to Scrum at Scale, there's literally over a dozen different components you can choose from. I know one of my favorite activities that we do, like in the Scrum at Scale workshops that we hold, is we actually create a heat map. And I talk about heat maps in our last webinar on Agile practices, where you can kind of figure out where is the area we should perhaps address first. And so when you create that heat map for your organization, you can figure out where you want to go. We just kind of gave 3 typical ones here, but again, with the modular structure of Scrum at Scale, you can start anywhere. So for your organization, you want to tailor it for where is your issue that you want to descale or detangle first. All right, so with that, we've got a few minutes here for Q&A. Maybe Jeff, you can help us out with some of the questions that you've seen come through.
There's a lot of questions flowing through. We've tried to prioritize them. Let me see what you think of this one. Would you consider it bad Scrum if an organization wants to have Scrum Masters who also have the duty of product owners, project managers, and developers as part of what they do? Why or why not?
Yeah, Carrie, since you talked about this one, maybe you want to take this?
Sure. So what I find is Scrum Masters and project managers, those particular 2 roles are very different, right? Project managers were in the legacy waterfall world out there to make sure that the product was getting delivered. And oftentimes it wasn't a product, the project was getting delivered. So it was all about hitting those key milestones. Whereas a Scrum Master is really about taking care of the team and getting things done. So making sure that that team has everything that they need, dealing with all of the impediments, escalating any impediments that they can't deal with at that team level. So they are very different roles. And I feel like if you tried to do both of those, you often will maybe stand in front of the mirror and argue with yourself, right? You're gonna have to take off your project management hat in order to argue as a Scrum Master to stop pushing so hard on the teams, or to stop pushing your key milestones that you need to get to on the teams. As far as a Scrum Master being a developer, I have seen that work. So in startup companies that I've worked with, as you know, some of them try to go around and rotate who the Scrum Master will be in order for everyone to actually understand that role, that servant leadership role. And then oftentimes they will find one person who does it the best and vote that that person keeps it. But I have seen developers take on that role. And the only issue you want to raise there is if it gets to be too much to try to do both of those types of roles. And then that you can use the retrospective to talk about and then change if needed.
Yeah, and if I can add on top of that, Carrie, when I see larger companies, especially at scale, when you've got multiple teams working together to create a product, having a dual role becomes a lot, because there is coordination and communication you need to do across teams. And so if you have a dual role there, it tends to be overwhelming.
I'd like to remind people that when I created Scrum, I specifically assigned all responsibilities for the project leader to the Scrum Master and the product owner in order to get the performance that we get with Scrum. And if you have a project leader or project manager in the mix, you will generate priority conflicts, which will slow teams down. So a project manager does not exist in Scrum. Here's another question. If I have to handle 3 teams, one of them has 16 members, including product owner and product manager, we keep getting issues with attendance. The team is distributed. hard to meet and plan ceremonies. I'm constantly having 11 to 12 people available and the rest missing. Should we consider splitting the team?
Yeah, maybe I can take this one on here. So my preference, and there's a great slide that we show, the ideal team size is 4.6 people. I'd hate to be that 0.6 of a person. So it's around 5 people or so. I would actually much rather have 3 teams of 5 rather than one huge team of 16 for a couple reasons. Number one, when you get above 6 or 7 folks, the lines of communication that you have to keep those people saturated with enough information to actually perform and do what they need to do become almost astronomical. It's an exponential curve. It becomes very difficult. The other thing that I see when you've got large teams like that is they start to splinter and fracture and they start to subgroup, and they're not really working together as a team on that particular product. So my particular preference is to have 3 smaller teams, each one with their own structure, and having a scrum of scrums as a mechanism for them to coordinate across the teams and things like that. That way, you actually get people showing up. You actually get more visibility into what folks are working on. You're getting the transparency that you need from that particular situation.
I'd like to remind people that on our training, we present the data from hundreds and hundreds of teams showing clearly that if a team of 6 takes about a year to get a project done, a team of 16 will take 6 months longer.
Okay.
So if you can't split the team, you should put 10 people on vacation at all times. Project in 6 months earlier, okay? This is a really important issue. One more question, then we'll be out of time. Contractual obligations. How do you use Scrum on a fixed price contract? You know, government bids require fixed price a lot.
Do you want to answer that one, Jeff?
Well, we do a lot of that. We have a company in Europe at CMI5 that does virtually all fixed price contracts. And they find that at CMI5, they can do a perfect waterfall. So doing waterfall or Scrum, they give the customer the option. They don't care. But they tell the customer that the Scrum project will be half the price of the waterfall project and have 40% fewer defects, plus or minus 3%. And they guarantee that because that's what they see over and over and over again. Now, the estimation, the Agile estimation that they do is using the Agile strategy that we use, where you break the backlog down into small pieces at the top, but bigger and bigger as you get deeper. And you estimate all the pieces in points. And that can be done a lot faster than the traditional waterfall hourly estimation, and the estimates are much more accurate. So they have often had to spend maybe 200,000 or 300,000 euro just to put together a proposal for a big defense application. With the Agile estimation, they can deliver a proposal at 20% of the cost. So they can basically do 5 proposals for the cost of 1. Their customers seem to always want the half-price version. And as soon as they introduced this option, in the very next year, their revenue doubled. So you can actually increase your revenue by doing things at half the price. So there's a lot of work on fixed price projects in Scrum, and a lot of information that's available. I suggest that you look on our website, and you can Google money for nothing and change for free. There's a strategy for implementing fixed price projects. We're at the end of our time. I'd like to remind people that there are Scrum at Scale courses all over the world at all times. This is a picture of just one snapshot. We even have Scrum at Scale in Timbuktu and Kathmandu if you're out there somewhere in the isolated areas of the world. And we have Scrum at Scale training classes for those who want to be trainers. There'll be a week-long trainer class in Boston in April. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, Steve and Carrie, for your presentation. Have a great day, and let's do better scrumming.